Everybody ready? Let's roll the cameras. And we are 1603. So there we go. 1576, A Quiet Life. Fair enough. All right. E4. Well, we respond with the Sicilian. And hopefully we finally get a main line. No, we still aren't getting any main lines. Knight to C3, which is a move that we faced once, maybe like 7 or 8 games ago. And it was a suspicious opponent, but it does appear that my opponent in that game might have been smurfing himself. But in any case, we've already discussed Knight C3 at length. And to summarize, the basic point about playing against Knight to C3 is that whichever line you play against the open Sicilian, you should play the corresponding line against Knight C3. So if you're a Najdorf player, you should play D6. If you're a Powelson player or a Taimanov player, then you should play the move E6. So you have to remember that on the next move, white can play Knight F3 and then D4 and transpose the game back into an open Sicilian. So it's very easy if you're not experienced to get what's called move ordered into a line that you do not play. And I'll summarize that once again after the game. Now, one really interesting move here that I think is very underrated, and it's a move that you absolutely should consider if you are an accelerated dragon player, which for the purposes of this speedrun, we are. This move obviates a lot of the theory that goes along with Knight C6, Bishop B5, which is what we faced the first time around. And this is a move which does fly under the radar, and that's the immediate G6. This was played against me by Vladimir Fedoseev, my good friend, who's now a very strong grandmaster. He played this against me when we were both about 2300, and I think it doesn't have too big of a downside. Of course, Bishop B5 in this position makes absolutely no sense. Okay, so our opponent transposes into a, or doesn't transpose, he plays a Grand Prix attack, and now we simply play the same way that we would if we had gone Knight C6. We fianchetto our bishop. We fianchetto our bishop. And I'm presuming that white's going to play Knight to F3 here. And then we put together, we carry out a setup that is considered to be the best way to play against the Grand Prix attack. And this is also a setup that you can take under consideration against the closed Sicilian. And the closed Sicilian and Grand Prix attack are in many ways similar. The chief difference between them is that in the closed Sicilian, white generally fianchettos the bishop. It's a lot more positional. In the Grand Prix attack, white goes for our throat by deploying the bishop either immediately or after a preliminary check on b5 to the square c4 in order to attack the f7 square. The Grand Prix attack is a very scary opening, especially for less experienced players. So if you're a Sicilian player who doesn't like facing the Grand Prix, watch this carefully, and then we will discuss the opening in greater length after the game. So first things first, we simply need to develop our pieces, and it makes perfect sense to start with the move Knight to C6. This is the most flexible move. We are not committing to any particular pawn moves just yet. We are going to wait for white to commit to a bishop square. There we go. Now we know more about white's setup. So as far as I know, there is a good move in this position for black that takes the sting out of a lot of the sort of scary aspect of the Grand Prix attack. What you want to avoid here, you want to avoid the move e6. Because if you play e6, then white takes our knight and then drives the pawn down to e5 and creates a complex of dark square holes on d6 and f6 and c5. And, you know, I've won games like this before from the other side. So we don't want to play e6. We certainly can play the move d6. d6 is a very legitimate line. But as far as I know, a good line here that flies under the radar a little bit is the immediate move Knight to d4. And Knight to d4 is a response that you should be sort of familiar with in general from other openings. In the Trompowsky, you get this type of move where the downside of putting the bishops on b5 and g5 is that they are vulnerable to Knight e4 or Knight d4. Now, obviously, this move offers a knight trade, and I like that our opponent is thinking, because I'm basically out of my own theory here. We're going to do some improvisation, and then after the game, we're actually going to check the theory. Castle's short. I think that's the right move. So white basically turns the tables back on us and says, if you want this bishop, go ahead and take it. And guess what? We most certainly want that bishop, because the light squared bishop in the Grand Prix attack is perhaps white's main attacker. When it positions itself on c4, it puts tremendous pressure on the f7 pawn, and that bishop is the bishop from hell in many Grand Prix attack positions. So we're just going to get rid of the bishop. We're going to trade. Okay, our opponent is thinking. Fair enough. Knight takes b5. Okay, I hope there were no alternatives there. And now, well, we have another dilemma. We have another dilemma. A lot of people, I think, would have the instinct of playing a6, right? a6 is kind of an instinctual reaction you have when you see a knight on b5. But let me take the opposite point of view, which is to say that, first of all, a6 we can keep for a rainy day. And second of all, it's not like the knight on b5 is causing us any imminent danger, right? It's not threatening to go to c7. No, it's definitely not threatening to go to d7. And it's just kind of sitting there. It's pretty vulnerable. It's undefended. So I think we should save the move a6 for a little bit later in the game, particularly because after a6, the knight drops back to c3, where it clamps down on the d5 square. Now, I don't think we should go queen b6. I don't think we should go a6. I think we should leave this knight b for the time being, and we should instead work on completing our kingside development. Now, if we go with the immediate knight f6, I don't like the look of allowing e5. White kind of drives that pawn into our position. So what we're going to start with is the move d6. We're going to start with d6. If you're a Sicilian player, this is kind of a very classic move. We're occupying and controlling some key central squares. And on the next move, we will be ready finally to develop our knight with or without a6. d5 was bad. d5, e takes d5. And then if queen takes d5, the knight does in fact access c7. Okay, d3. So now we continue our development. Again, I think a lot of people would be tempted to play bishop d7. Let's develop with tempo. But bishop on d7 is not a particularly noteworthy piece, and I still don't think that we should help white go back to c3. So I like the look of knight f6. There's also the move knight h6, which can sometimes be played in these types of lines, but let's play more conventionally in this game. We're going to go knight f6. I'm going to go knight f6. Okay. Yeah, so you might be wondering if e5 is dangerous here. I don't think e5 is dangerous because I think we can just take on e5. And if white takes back, we can go knight f6 at d5, kind of Alekhine style. Queen e1 by our opponent, playing very, very well. Our opponent is demonstrating knowledge of all the right Grand Prix attack ideas, and this is kind of the chief idea among them. White wants to play queen h4, and then f5, and then bishop h6, and knight g5, and there's a bunch of these typical Grand Prix attack moves that, if black falls asleep on, can result in rapid checkmate. So let me think for a second. This is actually a pretty complicated position. I'm sure that this is still probably within the confines of theory. My general approach here with black would actually be to delay castling. I think castling kingside allows the king to become a sitting duck and allows white to basically focus all of his efforts on checkmating us. So we have the idea of castling queenside. That's totally not out of the question. But that's kind of hard to organize, right? We still have the bishop, we still have the queen. We have to move both pieces if we want to castle queenside. But I actually kind of do. I actually do want to try to castle queenside. This is not a plan I have tried often in the Grand Prix attack. So here's the thing. If we play bishop d7, white goes knight c3. And then our queen doesn't have too many good squares. If we play queen c7 in that position, we're already running into the move e5. So we need to be very careful about how we position our bishop. I think a superior way of getting this done is to play bishop to g4. But then white still has the move e5, and that looks very, very nasty. So, geez, let me take a little bit more time here and think. Okay, I think the complications work out for us. I think we can play bishop g4. I think we can play bishop g4 and develop our bishop and prepare to play queen d8 to d7, hitting the knight and preparing to castle queenside. The other good thing about bishop g4 is that we can basically take the knight on f3 on demand. We can take the knight on f3 on demand. Now, the move I had to calculate was e5, right? e5 is the principled move that you always have to consider in these types of Grand Prix positions. But I think after e5, we play pawn takes pawn. White plays pawn takes pawn. We swing our knight over to d5. And the move that caused concern at first was knight f3 to g5. Hopefully you're still visualizing. But then I realized the black can castle kingside and simultaneously defend f7. And the line goes on. We'll talk about it after the game. But our opponent takes a different path, queen h4. Now we should continue with our general strategy. And I think we should play the move queen to d7. Yeah, I mean, castling queenside, listen, are we out of the woods on the queenside? Absolutely not. I mean, castling queenside is pretty brazen, I will admit, in this position. It is a very brazen concept, but I want to try it. I'm actually a lot more comfortable on the queen side than I am on the king side, because white has already amassed his queen, right? It's sitting on h4 and saying, you know, I dare you to castle kingside. You know, I'm not a betting man. Let's go the other way. Let's go the other way. We can take the knight first, and that might be sensible, because if we castle queenside immediately, white has this weird-looking move, knight f3 to g5. And if you think about it, that bishop on g4 is in a fair bit of trouble. White will be threatening h3 in that position. So I actually think we should eliminate the knight first, and then we should castle queenside. And I will admit it, I wouldn't say that I've been outplayed, but I definitely would prefer white here. I think white is better. But our position is fundamentally sound. And now we go queenside. Let's get the heck out of the range of the queen. Peculiar State says, I really don't like bishop takes f3, but hopefully you understood the logic. I also, in theory, do not love the idea of giving up my light squared bishop. We want to keep the bishop pair if possible, but there was a specific concern with the immediate castles. Okay, so sometimes you just got to do what you got to do. Okay, so what is our roadmap here? Well, there's like two categories of moves. There's moves that we can play to just make small improvements to our position. And what is like the typical move that you often play after you castle queenside? Who can tell me? This is like automatic in so many different positions because it improves the safety. Yeah, king b8, right? You want to go king b8 because the king on b8 is just safer than it is on c8. On c8, it's just, you know, the c file is more likely to open up. On b8, it also guards the pawn on a7, and it can run over to a8 if the necessity arises. So we can go king b8. What are some other moves that just make small improvements in our position? Well, I'm thinking about the move h7 to h5. Essentially restricting the white queen a little bit and also creating a stronghold on g4 on which we can plant. Well, we can plant the knight there and start out some attacking ideas with bishop d4, or we can put the queen on g4 and potentially offer a queen trade. And notice that if we play the move h5 and white responds with h3, we can potentially still play knight g4, because after hg, it's like a fishing pole idea. The rook on f3 will be hanging, and even if it's not hanging, the open h file might make it worth the sacrifice. So I'm thinking about king b8. I'm thinking about h5. I'm also thinking about the idea of playing h6 and g5 to blast open the g file. Let's not forget that white's king, it may seem totally safe for the time being, but if we can manage to open up the g file, we've got a lot of material sitting there on the king side waiting to attack the white king. So it is a double-edged position. It is a double-edged position. The move I'm kind of worried about, I think a very classy move for white, not an easy move for an intermediate player to play, is f5. Our opponent takes the concrete approach and plays e5, forces us to calculate. Let's get down to business. So let's calculate. Well, my instinct, of course, is to take this pawn because it essentially isolates as a result the pawn on e5. So let's calculate d5, f5. What options are available for the knight? Well, we were just talking about a particular square that I think is the juiciest square for the knight. And that, I think, is the g4 square. DEFE knight g4. White's probably going to grab the pawn on f7. And then as a result, I actually have a really cool idea there. I don't know if it's going to work. Does anybody see an option in that position? It is chaotic, but you should still see like a very tempting move. Yeah, so there's no bishop d4 check, but at a minimum, at an absolute minimum, we can play bishop g7 takes e5. And okay, the position is extremely double-edged. See, this is the kind of position I wouldn't even continue calculating. I would just assess intuitively the position as being super double-edged, but double-edged is good. Like, that's kind of what we want. And already I would just go for it. Like, we don't even have to look too deeply for other options. I would just take e5. But there are some very pretty tactics there. Some of you are noticing, actually. There's a crazy move, assuming we get this position. So there is queen d4 check, as many of you are indicating. But after queen d4 check, let's go knight g4. Rook takes f7, queen d4 check, king h1 is a critical position. And there you might say, well, we've got knight f2 check winning the queen. But no, and I've pointed this out before, when you make a discover check, you want to make sure that the piece that you are, quote unquote, discovering the check against cannot itself move away and capture the piece that's delivering the check. So you're discovering a check against the queen, but the queen itself is able to capture the knight that's giving the check. Does that make sense? Very common source of blunders. But here's the thing. If you think about it, rook takes f7, queen d4, check, king h1. Why is white able to capture on f2? Well, it's because of that pesky rook on f7 that's guarding the queen. So we come up with the idea when the distance between two pieces is large, there are a range of tactics that I call interception tactics. They're not quite interference. It's where you literally intercept a particular piece with another piece. So what move comes to mind? Well, after rook takes f7, you could start with bishop to f6. Okay, if white takes, then you give the check on d4. King h1, and knight f2 check actually wins the queen now. If the king runs the other way, king f1, then you have knight g4 to e3 check, also winning the queen, but not knight takes h2. The same reason, queen takes h2. But it's all a moot point. We'll explore that after the game. Our opponent has taken a different approach, knight e4. All right. Well, clearly, we should probably take the pawn on e5. Okay, that's pretty clear to me. The big question is, what should we take it with? Well, I like the look of knight takes e5 because it comes with tempo, and the knight on g4 is far from safe. A more adventurous move is bishop takes e5. I also like the look of that. Notice that knight takes c5 is not a threat because we'll pick off the knight with a check on d4. So both options are possible. Yours really depends on our risk tolerance here. I'm going to take a second to think about this. No, I actually like bishop takes c5. And there are some more subtle positional considerations that come into play here. On the other hand, bishop takes e5, rook takes f7. Wait a second. There's a cool idea. Oh my God, there's so much promise in this position. Okay, I might have seen an even more powerful improvement. There. Gosh, these lines get crazy. No, bishop e5, rook f7, queen d4 check. Yeah, I think that works. I think there's a very important check on d4 in that position. And I think for that reason, we should play bishop takes e5. And again, you're watching this and probably thinking, like, well, I'm confused. Like, what are you saying? And what are these lines? And again, I literally was calculating. I'm not able to always express it on the spot. That's what the post-game analysis is for. But there's a positional component to this move and then a tactical component to this move. The positional component comes into play if white plays the move h3. You should ask yourself here, what is white's strongest piece? Well, it's probably the knight. The knight is the only piece that's centralized. So what I want to do after h3 is just to drop the knight back to f6 and eliminate white's strongest piece. And if you keep calculating after knight takes f6 ef, or bishop takes f6, white is left with a bishop on c1 that's undeveloped. And not only is it undeveloped, but it's sort of tied down to the b2 pawn. So we leave ourselves with a much superior bishop in a simplified position. Okay? Now h3, we can also give a check on d4 first to avoid knight takes c5 and then go knight f6. Maybe that's more accurate. But there's also some tactics here. You have to once again calculate rook takes f7. And after rook takes f7, there is this check that we can give on d4. Our opponent takes on c5. Whoa. That's, I think, a blunder. But we have to be very careful here. Which piece do we check on d4 with? Who can tell me? Which piece do we deliver this check with? Because one move is tempting but wrong. The bishop is correct. The bishop is correct. Why? So what do I see here? Well, the knight on g4 is what we call a type 2 undefended piece. It's only protected by one other piece. What piece is it protected by? Well, it's protected by the queen. So in your mind, you should always think of what roles do the pieces have? What roles are they playing? And you want to make sure that you're not giving a piece too many roles. Well, the queen has the role of protecting the knight. If you go queen d4 check, white just goes king h1. And then if you take the knight, you have removed the defender on your own knight, and white can take on g4 with check. The bishop has no current role. We can give it a role. Its role is now going to be to pick up the knight. Now, there's a really cool idea here for white, which perhaps our opponent is banking on, and that's the move bishop c1 to e3. Our opponent might make this move. I hope he doesn't resign, because this has been a really interesting game. So what is the purpose of bishop e3? Well, it's to intercept the check while also protecting the knight. So wrong would be that to then take the knight on c5, because that bishop on e3 will recapture. Now, after bishop e3, does anybody see the win? Black has a forced win there. And it's a cool little maneuver. It's a cool little idea. You basically replace one piece with the other piece. Yeah, very nice. Malcolm Tucker definitely deserves a sub for that one. Bishop e3, we take it. And then the bishop is replaced with the queen. And we manage to keep our knight under protection while pinning the rook. There, the queen has two roles, and it fulfills both of them successfully. Now, obviously here, you do not want to go knight f2 check. Maybe some of you are thinking, just because of rook takes f2, that would be bad. No, it's time to claim our prize and take the knight and convert our extra piece. Now, I'm expecting our opponent to either take the pawn on f7, although it's a little bit too late for that, or to play the move h3. And you should start thinking about how you can meet h3 effectively. So we've won a piece, but this is actually a chance for us to practice accurate technique, because the game is not over. There's a lot still going on where king is not totally safe. And it's important not to get A, overexcited, and B, overwhelmed. You should remain very disciplined and understand what the priorities are. Now, if the opportunity for a queen trade presents itself, and it's a queen trade that does not give anything away, then we'll probably take it. I've talked about what I call the one-piece threshold rule. And the one-piece threshold rule just says that if you are up a piece or more, then you should seriously consider a queen trade as a way of simplifying your task. If you are up less than a piece, if you're up 2 pawns or 1 pawn, typically the strategy of trading off all of the pieces is a lot less effective, if that makes sense. Bishop f4. Our opponent develops this piece. And now we have many, many ways that we can play this, obviously. But let's try to diagnose the biggest issues in our position and fix them. So to me, the most annoying thing about Black's position is that the knight on g4 is kind of stuck in the ether. It's a little bit unprotected. Now, some of you then might say, well, let's play knight f6. But no, the knight on g4 itself is a very active piece. It's completely paralyzing White's entire kingside. So let's make a prophylactic move to remove that headache once and for all. Yeah, simply h5, a move that I pointed out earlier, h5. What's great about this move is that if White plays h3, we don't have to react, because hg is another fishing hook idea. Okay? Now, what other elements of the position could we fix? Well, this bishop on f4 is annoying me a little bit because it's restricting the mobility of Black's king. There is the move like d4 here, and you have to be very careful about, let's say, a rook lift to c3. So one subsequent move that comes to mind is to play bishop c5 back to d6 and just get rid of this darn bishop. Also e5. Yeah, e5 is a great idea, although not anymore because e5 blunders the pawn. Although you could still play it. You could still play it and trade. But if you really wanted to achieve e5, we have a very classy move here. This is a high-class move, right? You shouldn't abandon ideas just because you run into an obstacle. e5 doesn't work. Well, you might say, let's play rook e8. But there's a much better way to prepare the move e5. Generally, you should prepare things with the piece of lowest value. If you can prepare something with a pawn, it's often better than preparing it with a piece. Pawns are really, really good at helping other pawns move forward. So as all of you are pointing out, excellent job. F6 is the move. And as a good bonus, you're also threatening G5, fork. F6 is a multi-purpose move, but the main idea is to play E5 and shut this bishop down, put it out of commission, and give our king a little bit of breathing room so that there's no shenanigans with, you know, some sort of ridiculous rook lift or a check on C3, which otherwise could be very dangerous. Okay, so we're very methodical. And we're identifying things in the position that we can easily fix, and then we're fixing it. Yeah, white has no moves. I mean, this is the effect that these types of moves have on people. Like, white literally has just no moves. Because this is a threat. You know, we're just taking the air out of the building for white completely. No, we never played king b8. We never got around to it. It was just a move that I had pointed out as a hypothetical way to improve. But this is over. F6 is just a game-winning move. It just shuts everything down. The store is closed. The move speaks for itself, basically, by and large. By and large, the move speaks for itself. Yeah, unfortunately, this was a little bit anticlimactic. Like, knight takes c5 is really an unfortunate move. But we're still at the level where a lot of players, they're not able to handle like super chaotic positions or positions. I wouldn't call this a chaotic position. I'd call this a highly charged position or a position with a lot of tactical tension. And tactical tension creates the possibility, the higher possibility of a blunder because there's a lot more to keep track of and there's a lot more that's hanging and your brain often just short circuits in these situations. Bishop e3, speaking of short circuit, okay, obviously this move just gives up another exchange. What should we take on e3 with? Well, we can take with either piece. It literally does not matter. We can take with the knight. We can take with the bishop. I like taking with the bishop to keep this queen shut out as long as possible. We're also tempting white into playing h3, but okay, anyways. Okay, just making sure. Takes e3. And at this point, the job is virtually done. Okay, again, remember that when you reach a position like this, where you're up a full rook for no compensation, there's going to be a million ways that you can convert the advantage. So if you're trying to watch and learn, try to have in mind the high level ideas rather than the individual moves, because the individual moves don't really matter that much here. So in order to be safe, I want to solve the last remaining problem of our position, which is just the fact that, you know, the king on c8 is a little bit airy. It's a little bit airy. I don't want to have to deal with the headache of a check on c4 or a rook lift. So I love the move queen d4. Yeah, queen d4 is probably what I'd play in a classical game. But the Magnus move is definitely just king back to b8. I love queen d4, though. Queen d4 is such a nice move because it just eliminates... I mean, you're attacking b2 and you're offering a queen trade. So I like queen d4 and I like king b8. You know, both moves are possible. Okay, we'll play concretely. I know more people are suggesting queen d4, so we're going to go for it. Of course, what you have to be careful about here is the response rook to e4. And there you have to see that after queen takes b2, the king is actually totally safe on c8. Because there was a check on c4, but the king would run to b8. Queen e1. Okay, it is not worth allowing rook takes c7. Let's shut down all of white's remaining counterplay. e5, right? The move we wanted to play a little bit earlier. Now it's time for it. Now these two pieces are just biting on granite. So if white plays c3, then we drop our queen back to b6, continuing to operate with tempo. And then we'll probably pile up on that d3 pawn and finally crash through. Bathtub formation here. Nicely done. This is from straight from the pawn endgame video. This is the bathtub formation. Of course, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's not a pawn endgame. Yeah, the fact that the queen is protected doesn't matter. White can't really attack it that easily. But this is the downside of these long speedrun games that, you know, the game is over. We're just chilling. But hopefully you're not too bored. Rook e4. Well, I see No real reason not to take on b2. There is a little trap there. We have to be actually a little bit careful. Queen takes b2, rook to b4. Okay, watch out. Queen takes b2, rook to b4. And you can't take on c2 because the rook moves over to c4 with a fork. And the pawn on d3 is still alive. So we can take the pawn, but in response to rook b4, you're just going to have to take the pawn on a2. And again, since we've decided to play this very concretely, I would point out two things. Why am I not scared? How do I know that, let's say, the check on c3 isn't scary? Well, first of all, there isn't even a hypothetical mating construction. Right? There's no way for white to get rid of the b7 pawn. So the king on b8 is always going to be safe as long as you can keep the b7 pawn protected. The second thing is that white's back rank was terribly weak, so I know that anytime the queen moves away, I basically have back rank mate. Okay, now we can take another pawn, but even more clinical, let's crash through. Let's just get down to business here. What's the move that shows our opponent we mean business? Excellent. Guys, all getting it, rook to c8. Forcing white to, you know what, or get off the pot. Either trade rooks or move the rook away and allow us to take c2, linking up the queen and the rook and setting the precursor for queen trade. Now, our opponent's probably going to go queen e4. And you can never, ever, ever relax in these situations. You always have to watch for mate threats. I know it sounds very simple, but just anytime you're, let's say, up a rook, up a queen, remind yourself to go through the mental checklist on every move. Is my opponent threatening checkmate? Okay. Are there any weak squares that I need to keep track of? Now, what's the simplest way to play here? Already, we should be looking for queen trades, right? Because by the piece threshold rule, you're up a rook, so a queen trade would make things much easier. And if you look for a queen trade, you will find one. We start with a check. This is a check. King moves up, and that pawn on e5 is really the hero. No mouse slipping. You check f4, and you force the queen trade. That's it. And now the rest is obvious without too much commentary. And our opponent says GG. Thank you. Yeah, very nice. Very nice. Okay. Let's analyze. So we are going to use ChessBase, I think, to take a look at some Grand Prix attack theory. I'm going to pull up ChessBase 17, which hopefully will work. So we have Stockfish here. And the move that I recommended is g6. Now, when I said that g6 has no downside, it was a bit of a lie. There is a move here that white could try, and this is a very principled idea. This is, by the way, also the reason why a lot of players don't go g6 here, right? You might say, well, if you're a dragon player, why don't people go g6 more often? Why do people play knight c6 and allow the Rosolimo, which is a huge line, right? Why not just go g6? Well, the reason partially is because there's this line where white plays queen takes d4, and you can see how scary this looks, right? You got to go knight f6, and now white follows through with e5. But according to theory, this particular line is considered to be equal. You can see Stockfish's eval is equal, and that's actually the truth. This gets very theoretical. I won't delve into this because right now we're looking at the same position, but with the knight on c3 rather than f3. So let's take a look. Queen takes d4, knight to f6, knight to f6. There are some games in the database here. Carlsen had this against Jan Krzysztof Duda in Blitz. But apparently this is not so dangerous for black. Carlsen played bishop e3. And you basically get like a dragon type position. 17 games in the database. Duda played d6. Okay, probably doesn't matter. f3, bishop g7. So you almost get like a transposition into some sort of weird dragon-like position. Carlsen played knight g2. And Duda played this weird move, bishop c8 to e6, while developing the bishop, but walking right into knight f4. So strange move, and now white is threatening to ruin black's structure. That was a bad move by Duda. This is a blitz game. So correct, according to the engine here, would have been to play queen a5, which is a very sensible move. And you basically get this super double-edged position. high. And already the engine likes bishop e6. It says white is slightly better, but, you know, I would play this with black. I think this is sufficiently double-edged. And, you know, somebody who had the white pieces would have to know all of this and feel confident in this super tactical position. King b1, rook c, pretty easy play for black here. So you can dig around here on your own, but clearly this is not a refutation. So d4 and queen takes d4 you should be aware of. I also point out, that the move e5 is not dangerous here. Why? Because black has the counter-attacking move knight c6. Basically, the queen has to move and keep contact with e5, and it's very awkward. Queen e3, knight g4 wins the pawn, right? If queen f4, then black plays knight h5. Don't be afraid to put your knight on the rim in such positions. And now look at this. You'll like this. Bishop g7. This looks like a blunder. Who can tell me why? Who can tell me why bishop g7 looks like a blunder here? This is a valuable idea to remember. It's because of g4 winning the knight. But after g4, there is the move d5, and this is why I love the Sicilian. Now you're like, oh my god, what's going on here? Well, if white takes en passant, then the knight can drop back, and white's position is in shambles. And if white plays knight takes d5, then bishop takes g4. The queen is overloaded. It has to defend the knight. But if it takes the bishop, then we take the knight, and white's position is collapsing. It's -4, because everything is falling. I mean, just look at white's position. So this is a valuable idea to remember, knight h5 and d5. You wouldn't be able to find this without preparation. And if white plays knight f3, then we are in time to contest that e5 pawn. We go d6. And again, g4, here there is even the move f5, forcing this pawn to move out of the way. Or if en passant, then black recaptures with the knight. So brilliant ideas, f5 and d5. And black's position is just so rich here. So long story short, d4 is a move. But unless white plays it like Magnus, it's nothing to be super afraid of. So let's continue the analysis. Well, I am the boxer. You're saying this is above my head, but if you could specifically tell me which move doesn't make sense, I'll explain it more slowly. I'll explain it more thoroughly. So if you're watching and you're like a beginner, I understand that some of this will seem overwhelming, but I'm really trying to break down every move so it makes perfect sense. And if it doesn't, I'm happy to repeat it or rephrase it. There's nothing embarrassing about going at your own pace. All right, so g6, our opponent played the Grand Prix attack, bishop g7, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to b5, which is a very topical move. If you look at reference, the main line in this position is bishop b5. It is now considered the most popular move, and it scores well. So it's a very important move to know. The engine does like knight d4. The fish likes knight d4. And here, our opponent, let's see if he goes down the main line. Yes, he does. Castles is the main line. Over 1,000 games. So we played knight takes b5. So let's take a look at it. Knight takes b5. Okay, 1 second. I don't know what's going on. Nico, please stop. I think that's Nico. Nico, please stop. It's making the annoying sound. Thank you. So knight takes b5 isn't necessarily the best move, but I actually love the engine's recommendation here. I love the engine's recommendation here of d5. This is a move you would never play unless you knew it was good. Now, it looks like a blunder, right? I mentioned during the game that this move is a blunder because of e takes d5. 173 games in the database. But after a6... Now, obviously, queen takes d5. Everybody should see why this is wrong, because it blunders a fork, okay? But you play a6, knight c3, and knight f6, and you simply win the pawn back. And you win the pawn back and with interest, right? Black has the bishop pair. This pawn is sticking out like a sore thumb. You're controlling the f5 square. So I love the move d5, and it's been played. And in order to not be worse, it appears that white needs to play e5. But when the center closes in the Grand Prix attack, you can actually play the move d4. What is the purpose of this move? To restrict the white knight and prevent it from coming back to c3. And after a6, you're going to force the knight onto this super awkward a3 square. Okay, white has to play the engine move c3. I think most humans would play d3. There are some games in the database here. a6, knight a3. And as is very typical in such positions, when you see this structure, f4, e5, you should immediately be thinking of the light squares. What light squares? Well, the light squares that are around the pawns are all very weak, And you can exploit it by developing the knight to h6. Don't be so, this is a typical move, because also the knight is heading for f5 and perhaps later for e3. And if white plays, for example, h3, you can play the engine move b5, restricting the knight. And you should never be afraid of this situation, because look at how weak white is on the king side. The king is wide open, queen d5 is coming, and later in the game you could play the move f6 and open up a little pathway for the knight to go back to f7. So the important conclusion from this analysis, and you can see that the engine actually doesn't necessarily think that knight takes bishop is the best move. But I don't know, a6 is the engine top recommendation right now at depth 30. So maybe it's worth investigating. I will leave that to you to take a look at the move a6. I really like this idea, though. Knight takes b5, knight takes b5, d5. It's simple, it's easy to remember, and most importantly, it's very testing, right? This is how you choose lines. It's super testing, because white already has a chance to be much worse. 172 games when e takes d5. Most people, even GMs, did take this pawn, and that's a mistake, right? White can also play the move d3. But here, I love the engine recommendation. a6, knight c3. And now you take it. And then you take it. And then you go into a slightly better endgame. 2 games in the database. White is worse. White has weak pawns. And we don't care about giving away the fianchettoed bishop because it's an endgame, right? Does that make sense? So no matter what white does, I like black's position. And our move was d6. We played a popular move. But after our opponent's response, d3, I think the position is probably about equal. And after we played knight f6, our opponent responded with queen e1, still 38 games in the database. And you can see here that the engine is not the biggest fan of this for black. And I have a feeling that after bishop g4, we were already worse. Yeah, bishop g4 is kind of inaccurate. It's a novelty. And already, the position is slightly dubious. So let's transition now from ChessBase to chess.com, because the sort of part of the game where we use the engine has elapsed. Now we go into the middle game, and that I'd like to analyze without the engine, unless there are any opening questions. This is what opening analysis looks like, right? And of course, we left some stuff out. What did we leave out? Well, we didn't analyze the entire Grand Prix attack. There's bishop c4, very major line, and here the response is e6, followed by knight g7. This is the classic Botvinnik setup. And of course, we left out, no, not this move, alternatives to castles, right? White can take the knight, for example, but this is all bad for white, and you can analyze this on your own with an engine. I will show you the basic idea of the Grand Prix through the lens of the game continuation. So let's remove the engine. Let's switch back to our chess.com screen. I apologize if this was, a drag or boring, but remember, this is an opening speedrun, so I am trying to give you as much opening knowledge as possible and really help you build a repertoire from scratch if that's what you desire. Okay, so knight d4, castles, takes, d6, d3, knight f6, queen e1. And in order for you to understand the basic idea of the Grand Prix, let us consider the move castle short. Where is the queen going in the Grand Prix? Well, it's going to h4. Why is it going to h4? Well, again, to illustrate the idea, let's take a sample line. Let's say black goes here, attacking the knight, white goes back, and let's say black starts attacking on the queen side, and you go b5. Okay, who can tell me what white's next move is? And this is a terrifying move. I can show you right off the top of my head. I can do a search for 1,000 games that have ended precisely in this way. Okay, in various versions, right? Not necessarily exactly in this way, but in very similar ways. Let me actually run a little search. Here we go. This is the game between 2 pretty decent players. Now watch. Grand Prix attack. Black plays it very similarly. It's actually following our game, basically. This is literally, not exactly. Now watch. Bang. F5. Black does exactly what we think. A6, I'm going to start preparing some attack. Bang. Bang. Bishop h6, this is why you play f5. FG, HG, bang. And now the beautiful combination. This is one of the typical ideas in the Grand Prix. Does anybody see it? This is gorgeous. You will enjoy this a lot. Rook takes f6 is correct. Now black has 2 recaptures. If e takes f6, then it's all very easy. Bishop g7. And it's mate. Whichever way you take, it's either mate on h7 or mate on h8. But what happens after bishop f6? Does anybody see the move here? Yes. Bishop to g7, and black resigns because it's the same problem. If you take the bishop, you get mated on h7. If you take the knight, you get mated on h8. So this is just one very, very simple illustration. Here's another one. And I'm only trying to find games with, serious players. This is a completely different game. But this is the beauty of studying openings carefully, because once you acquaint yourself with the ideas, you realize how repetitive these openings can actually be. 2000, right? Panesso against Panesso. I wonder if they're siblings. Henry Panesso is a Colombian. I am. Here you go again, right? Now bishop takes c6. This time white gives away the light squared bishop straight away. Now watch. Queen e1. What does white do? Bang. Bang. h3. Slow move. Bang. 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 And if you're paying attention, you already know. Rook f6, bishop f6, bishop g7. And black resigned. Completely different game. Ends in exactly the same way. So this is just one micro illustration of how dangerous this attack can be, the Grand Prix attack can be. And this is why I was terrified of castling kingside. Okay? I could show you a million other ideas, but this is just a little flavor of how dangerous the Grand Prix can be. And this exact thing could have happened in this position, right? f5. And remember that g takes f5 does not help, right? It actually makes things worse because now the king is even weaker. And again, knight g5 is coming. And another idea that you should keep in mind is that after knight g5, there is this typical concept of going knight to d5. This is not just a Grand Prix attack idea. It's a deflection. It's a simple deflection. What are you deflecting? Well, you're deflecting the knight from the h7 pawn. So almost all Grand Prix attacks that end successfully end in a checkmate on h7. And this is why I did not want to castle and touch that with a 10-foot pole. This is why we did all of what we did. Bishop g4. Queen h4. And queen to d7. Knight comes back to c3. And again, why did I have to take on f3? Because here I was worried about the move knight g5. And apparently, according to the engine, that black is fine. And the reason black is fine, this is what I missed. Rook df8 h3. Who can tell me what black's best move is here? Who sees a little detail that I missed? Oh, it's a beautiful line. h6, counterattacking the knight. Counterattacking the knight. And if white takes, black takes. And with the h file open, this is just over. This is over red rover. The bishop's coming in. So white has to move the knight back. And now we have a brilliant engine move. g5. Blast it all open. Takes, takes. Double attack on the queen. Queen takes g5. Now watch how the engine plays. Just bishop e6 is good. But even bishop takes h3 is good. Rook f g8 setting up threats against the queen. Now we drive the rook up to h5. The queen is forced onto an awkward square. If it moves back, bishop h6, another discovery. And now black is just squashing white like a bug here. This is how strong. I mentioned this, right? Black can actually attack on the king side as well, which is quite ironic. But this is just a flavor of that. Anyways, I did not see the move h6. So that's why I decided it prudent to trade on f3 first. Probably an inaccuracy. Oops, sorry. Bug there. So we took on f3 and then we castled. Now I think white is slightly better here, but position is probably more or less equal. Okay? e5 is already a mistake. It's premature. White is opening up the center without being ready for it because white is underdeveloped. White doesn't have his bishop out. And the white king is actually much weaker than black's king. The moment this move was played, I was already considering ideas related to queen d4. What should white have done? Well, the move that I was a little bit concerned with is f5. I think f5 is a good move to open up a longer diagonal for the bishop. I think another good move the engine proposed is bishop d2. Just get the bishop out. Why not bishop e3? Because that runs into knight g4. So bishop d2 I think is a very good move. We would have played king b8. White can play rook b1 to prepare the move b4, opening up the b file, and we do the same thing on the king side. So the position becomes very double-edged. The engine is giving like 0.3, 0.4, which is totally reasonable, but our king is obviously much safer here than on the king side. Yeah, king h1, absolutely. I would consider a move like king h1. But the problem with king h1 is that I think we're kind of running into h6 and g5. Remember, if the h file opens, that this is going to be counterproductive. But I don't want to bog ourselves down too deeply into this position because it's just a complicated position, right? And you can dig around on your own here. e5. I want to share some of my analysis here. And of course, the topical move is rook takes f7. Now, just to repeat what I said, queen d4, king h1, and knight f2 wins the queen. No, it doesn't because of queen takes f2. So the idea that comes to mind is bishop g7 to f6. But amazingly, this doesn't appear to work. Because if you keep calculating, king f1, knight e3 check, bishop takes e3, we win the queen, right? But it's not the end of the story because what does white have in return for the queen? Well, a bunch of stuff. White has this monster pawn on e7. White actually has 2 pawns total and 2 minor pieces. So black's material advantage is not that vast. But here's the critical detail as the engine proposes. Here white has the cold-blooded move king to g1. And all of this hinges on a critical tactic. Who can tell me what happens after rook takes e7? Type 2 undefended piece. What's defending it? The queen. We chase away the queen with the simple move g3. The queen has nowhere along this diagonal to stay, to keep in contact with the rook. Black is lost. Black is lost. So this is just amazing. These lines are crazy. And according to the engine, white is better after king g1 because black is just paralyzed. Yeah, you've got the extra queen, but your rooks are totally tied down. White's got a bunch of these active moves that he can play. Well, I guess not rook e1, but rook to f1 and knight d5 and c4, and it's amazing. But here's what else is amazing. In this position, white has an unbelievable move that forces a draw. It's an unbelievable move. White doesn't even have to give away the queen. Think about it. It's a ridiculous engine move. And you will just, this will knock your socks off. Bishop to e3. Queen takes e3, and now king to h1. And sorry to get so excited about that. I just think these are cool lines. Now you're like, this is smothered mate, right? I learned about this. This is smothered mate. But it's not because of the queen on h4. Right? You actually cannot deliver smothered mate here. And this is why you can't just blindly apply tactical concepts. You actually have to match them to the specific position on the board. Now, you might say, well, no problem. Am I really saying that black has no effective discoveries here? That's exactly what I'm saying. Because if you play knight takes d3, you can win a pawn, but that's the most you can win. Where are you going to go? Knight e4, big deal, king h1. If you try some shenanigans, then white gets the rook into the game and takes e7, and this is no good. So there's actually no effective discovery other than to repeat moves. Insane. So this was the wrong idea. Bishop f6 is the wrong idea. The correct move is actually a very zen move. Very zen move. Again, it's the principle of trading away your opponent's strongest piece. It's such a powerful idea. White has only one active piece, and it's the rook. So we trade it. Just go rook f8. Deceptively simple move. And of course, you have to see that here you have queen e4, but this is easy to calculate. And this is mate. And here, if white tries bishop e3, well, then obviously the situation has changed. And after knight f2, king g1, you have this rook on f8, and knight d1 leads to mate in 2. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. So rook f8 is incredibly strong. It's actually winning for black. Rook hf8. White has to take it. And now you simply take back and just look at the storm clouds that have gathered around white's king. Queen d4 is essentially unstoppable. There's just nothing that white can do against this threat. And the game is over. The game is over. So just the power of these ideas. Our opponent, of course, plays knight e4 and bishop takes e5. And yeah, our opponent blundered on the spot with knight takes e5. But of course, the move that I was expecting here, well, first of all, if rook takes f7, here I was actually planning to go rook f8, either rook hf8 or rook df8. And again, the game is over. Probably more accurate is to play rook df8 to keep h7 defended. And according to the engine, rook back to f3 is the only move, but now knight takes h2 is very strong. And this is like -3 because this is coming in and we're up a pawn and the king is weak. This is not worth analyzing too deeply. Black is just overwhelmingly better. So I think the white is not much that he can do here. He's already down a pawn, and we're also attacking. So this was not good. h3, I was planning to go knight f6. But it occurred to me that this is a blunder because white can play knight takes c5. So instead, we should play the preliminary intermezzo bishop d4. And now you can go back to f6. But even better is to play the move f5. Just counterattacking the knight. Get it out of e4. Now, this is also overwhelming. So the idea after bishop to e3 was to play bishop takes e3 check. Replacement idea. Takes, and the queen replaces the bishop. Queen d4. And now the queen defends the knight and attacks the rook. Black wins a full rook. Okay? So there's just nothing that white can do. White is forced to lose a piece. And the rest, I think, we're going to present without too much analysis. h5 to solidify. And then, of course, the winning move is f6. This is really the move that ends all of white's resistance because everything is coming and white ends up giving away the rook. We take it. And the rest was very straightforward. The last thing I'll say, if we fast forward a little bit, rook b4 would have been the last try. If you're on the white side in these positions, this just shows you that you can always set a trap, always. And of course, queen c2, rook c4 check would needlessly complicate the task. Black is still winning, by the way. Black is still winning because we've got a billion pawns, but why would you ever do that? Why would you not just take on a2 and win the game? And all of these checks are not dangerous. You just go king b8. And remember, it's not possible to just like force a perpetual. That's not how it works. You can just hide the king away and then block with the queen, and you're good to go. Okay, so that was actually deeper analysis than I had expected in that game. I know I went really kind of down under the surface in the opening and the middle game, but I hope you really enjoyed that analysis. That was really, really fun for me. Unless there are any questions, I think it's time for us to call it a night. So if you're new to my stream and you want to support, I've got a Patreon, I've got Twitch. Obviously, all subs are greatly appreciated. But the most important thing is to subscribe on YouTube if you like the content, as we try to hit 400,000 subs by next year. That's the goal. We're trying to grow at a very modest pace of 100,000 per year, and maybe one day in the far future, hit 500K. So that's the goal. So have a fantastic MLK weekend, everybody, and I will see you very soon.